Hello economics students, this is the last video of this outcome on the international economy, so well done on making it this far. We are almost there. We're going to look at some of the some very similar concepts that we've already covered so far in this outcome, the terms of trade, exchange rates and international competitiveness. The key difference in this dot point and in this video is we're now looking at the effect of movements or changes in these variables, the terms of trade, the exchange rates and international competitiveness. Looking at the effect of a movement in these things on our three domestic macroeconomic goals. So strong and sustainable growth, full employment, and low and stable inflation. And also, as always, living standards. The way that we do this is we start to think about these things, these three variables or these three factors as both aggregate demand and aggregate supply factors. So if you struggle with the aggregate supply and aggregate demand part of this video, I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at the macroeconomics videos. So firstly, we need to start thinking about the terms of trade as an aggregate demand factor. And the reason for that is if there was an improvement in the terms of trade or a favorable movement in the terms of trade because our export price index, sorry about the writing here, increased, that actually means that the value of our exports in the AD formula has increased. So we can make a direct link from export prices to aggregate demand. And to dig a little bit deeper, the reason for that is the value of our exports, or the X component in our AD formula, is calculated by timesing price, or price times quantity sold. So the price of our exports times the volume or the quantity of exports that are actually sold. Now if we assume that quantity stays the same, e.g. we don't sell less because the price has gone up, but the price goes up, well, you can straight away see that that would lead to an increase in the X component in aggregate demand. So whenever there's an improvement in the terms of trade, that's good for aggregate demand. If there's a deterioration in the terms of trade or an unfavorable movement, that's bad for aggregate demand. But there's a few more points to make here, because when our Australian companies, some of our big mining companies, are benefited by higher commodity prices, higher export prices, what happens is Australians who own these companies through shares receive higher dividends. Individuals that work at these companies tend to receive higher wages, they might receive a bonus, and the business itself receives higher profits. The other thing that happens is governments, particularly state governments, receive higher revenues, receive higher tax revenues because they charge some of our, particularly the coal industry, royalties. The higher the price of coal, the higher the royalties that governments receive. So because of all these kind of extra things, these are a bit extra to the first dot point, or the first slide, it means that there's actually an increase in I because businesses use some of this profit to invest into new machinery and equipment to develop a new mine. Households who have higher dividends and wages are going to spend back into the economy. And the government who's received higher coal royalties or whatever royalties they are likely to spend some of that money back into the economy. All of which increase aggregate demand. So there's some extra points there for you. We also need to think about the terms of trade as an aggregate supply factor. And when we're thinking about the terms of trade as an aggregate supply factor, we're really focusing on import prices. So we're not so much thinking about exports, we're thinking about import prices. Now, import prices are important to Australian businesses, and therefore the ability and willingness of our Australian businesses to produce, or the aggregate supply curve, because Australian businesses rely on a lot of imported capital and machinery from overseas. So if the price of those things go up or down, that will affect their cost of production and therefore will change their ability and willingness to produce and therefore our output as an economy. So here's a little rule for you. If there's an increase in the terms of trade because there's a decrease, a decrease, I had it the wrong way around, because of a decrease in import prices, that would be an improvement in the terms of trade. That is both good for aggregate demand and also good for aggregate supply, because our businesses are more willing and able to produce. However, if there's a decrease in the terms of trade, that's bad for AD and AS. On the AS side, it's because of the cost of production increase, and that will restrict our ability and willingness to produce. Okay, this next slide here is about exchange rates. We did a lot about work about it on exchange rates and their impact on the macroeconomic goals in the last outcome. So I'm not going to talk much about this. All I want to say is remember that it can be both an AD and an AS factor for the same reasons that I just looked at in the previous slide. And your job is, particularly when you're looking at it from an aggregate demand side, in fact, only when you're looking at it from an aggregate demand side, is to think what happens to exports and imports. One always becomes cheaper, one always becomes more expensive. One will go up and one will go down. And so use that rule to help you, but go back and have a look if you need to. There's a little slide here for you to go through. Maybe I'll just quickly do this to make sure we know. An appreciation of the AUD is bad for our exporting businesses. It makes them more expensive. Good for importers, which will decrease AD and decrease growth in the Australian economy and decrease material living standards. I'm not sure what's going on here. Vice versa for a depreciation. Now the last one here is on international competitiveness. It's pretty simple. If we become more internationally competitive, that's a good thing for aggregate demand because we'll be able to sell more exports and we'll actually buy less imports as we substitute away from imported goods. So if there's an improvement in international competitiveness, it's an increase in aggregate demand, which is good for growth and good for living standards. Now, just quickly, before we're almost done, remember all of these things, your job is to think about what happens to aggregate demand, what happens to aggregate supply. Sometimes it's both, but it's usually or. I think you can always focus on one. And then from here to draw the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. And you can see that if there's an increase in the terms of trade, which will mean more national income, more exports, more etc., because a shift in the aggregate demand curve, leads to a shift in the aggregate demand curve. From there, you can work out what happens to all three goals and living standards just by looking at the X and Y axis. And if you need a refresher on that, go back and have a look at macroeconomics. All right, as always, reach out if you have any questions at all. I forget to say this, but put comments in the in whatever it's called, the comment section, and I will respond. Some people are asking me about videos for answering SAC questions. They're all there under a playlist called Answering SAC Questions. Good luck. Bye for now.